As usual, another great guest, but a quick diversion. You'll notice that our full name is the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a moment. If you'd like to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and be able to see alternative doctors or go across state lines for care, then you definitely need to take a look at patientempowerment.mpb.health and see if that's the fix you've been looking for. Now, let's get back to the show.
Welcome, folks, to Freedom Hub. This is an interesting topic today, Jim. Smart cities.
Sure is.
You know, I got a house in Capitol Hill from my lobbying days, and you're up there in Bethesda with all the snobs. We hate congestion, don't we?
Yes, we do.
And reading some articles that are like a decade old, Scott, I saw that, that's one of the selling points for smart cities is to get to your job or wherever you want to go, or maybe somewhere in the city behind you and that nice screen you got, without the congestion. Mm-hmm. And I think people would say, sign me up just for that selling point. I think through some of the zoning and housing and transport policies that you consult on, I think a lot of us would like to see, would like to unleash the architects, in that Ayn Rand fashion. It wasn't Atlas Shrugged, it was Fountainhead, right? The architect who would not brook any bastardization of his product, right? What did he do? He dynamited a housing complex instead of allowing it to be pushed by the smart city people of the time, decades ago. But, just as the COVID hysteria has awakened people to regulatory capture with our health bureaucracies, people are starting to hear about some of the equally smothered science around the antenna build out for wireless. And, as the lobbyist for the oldest health freedom organization, we have a campaign based on this infrastructure law that just was passed to have hearings because all the money is going to wireless. And some of the professionals in the fiber cabling industry are wondering why that is, because, you can dig or connect wires to the premises. And then what you do in your business or house at that point, to have some wireless flexibility is up to you. But there is no informed consent, and there won't be in the smart cities because the Internet of Things has to have antennas and receivers and transmitters everywhere for it to work. And that gets to sort of the more sinister, nefarious implications of the radiation mesh, and that is tracking and how, whether it's Internet of Things or the vaccine passports or the carbon footprint or the digital currency, or Biden's new disinformation junta. If you don't behave, you're not going to eat. And the behavioral manipulation potential of all of these connected plans through smart cities potentially, it's got a lot of us worried. Now, I don't know, Scott, to what extent you focus on those things in your LinkedIn. You're definitely an eminent journalist, submitting articles to Forbes and the Independent Institute. I think we've had several scholars from there present over the years. David Thoreau on C.S. Lewis, Ivan Eland, my old Cato colleague on foreign policy, jingoism, maybe a couple others. Scott's the owner of the Market Urbanism Report. So if we're going to get an honest update on what we want, we love cities. Who doesn't love a visit to the city for this or that entertainment? We want good, creative, wonderful cities. We do. And so, Scott, why don't you go ahead? And then afterwards, I've got Murray Bauer, a radio frequency engineer, who's going to comment on the smart city on the ground happening in Stafford County between Fredericksburg and DC, to see how some of this is happening and some of the things we need to be concerned about. But take it away, Scott. I think you have some slides to show.
Sure.
And I'm going to stop my share.
Okay. Yeah, I'll start off by just saying thanks for the opportunity to speak. I think there's a lot of overlap, obviously, between Market Urbanism Report and Freedom Hub. Although I consider myself somewhat of a techno-libertarian, and I have a generally positive view of technology and the role it can play in cities. So I'm sure as I present and then we go to the Q&A, we can kind of flesh through and debate some of these different ideas. But yeah, I'll go ahead and share my screen. The name of my talk is What is Market Urbanism? And just to introduce myself, my name is Scott Beyer. I'm a columnist for Governing Housing Online and the Independent Institute. I do a lot of freelance stuff for other magazines such as the American Conservative and City Journal. Do a lot of radio and TV interviews as well. And so I'm really somewhat of a consultant, but really more of a journalist who covers the urban issues beat. I also own Market Urbanism Report, something I started 4 years ago, and it's a media company dedicated to advancing free market urban policy. This is our logo, and yeah, I'd say it's an exciting young movement that my personal company here has a 50,000 person social media following, and I would say it tends to attract young, kind of ideologically diverse people who live in cities and are disgruntled about some of the problems that arise in cities and are interested, even though they're not free market absolutists per se. They tend to be open to how market economics can solve some urban issues. So what is market urbanism? It's a policy theory that applies free market economics to urban issues. I would say it's rooted very much from the classical liberal tradition of Adam Smith and Frederick Hayek, and maybe even more to a degree to the writings of Jane Jacobs, who applied certain Hayekian classical liberal ideas to urban growth. And it's really, I'd say it's two things. Market urbanism is really two things in a sense. On one hand, I like to explore the idea of market urbanism as a theory. And I believe this aspect of market urbanism will be more relevant to Freedom Hub, which is, it's really asking the question of, okay, so if we have cities that are completely anarcho-capitalist or libertarian and really do away with the idea of having municipal governance, how would cities work? And the reason I call that a theory is that it's very seldom tried around the world. Most big cities around the globe are in fact government-run municipalities. And so it's a little bit, market urbanism in the absolute sense is a little bit of a thought experiment or an abstraction. Although I'm really interested in a lot of the private cities. There are some examples of private cities and kind of like these techno-libertarian crypto cities that you hear about that are popping up in the experimental form around the world. And I'm really keeping track of those and seeing how they might apply to market urbanism or how market urbanism can work off of those examples. On the other hand, market urbanism is a policy package. And this is more where my consulting side comes in, which is that rather than dealing in abstraction, the goal of market urbanism is to go into existing cities and talk about more incremental free market reforms that can apply to the existing urban context. So for example, if I go into New York City or San Francisco, obviously it's not just full of libertarians who want free market outcomes, but market urbanism might be able to propose certain libertarian light type ideas that could be applied to the existing municipal governance and kind of push in that direction. So for this talk, I'm going to focus really more on this latter. this latter version of market urbanism. And really, we focus on two things: housing and transportation. So our stance for housing is that it can be built in the location, at the size, in the design, and at the density that the consumer wants. So what type of regulations would need to be overturned in order to make something like that happen? Well, first and foremost, zoning. Zoning is the idea that land parcels can be regulated by the government to reach a certain density or use or setback. And market urbanists are basically against the idea of zoning. We'd like to see it overturned altogether. We also go after parking minimums. Parking minimums being the idea that if a developer builds a certain development, they have to provide a certain amount of parking based on the square footage or the amount of units in the project. Market urbanists are against parking minimums. We don't think the government should be setting the minimum amount of parking, and that the market should get to decide that. Building codes. I'm very against building codes. I think that this could theoretically, and often is, can be a private sector creation that there's so many aspects of the building industry that have an incentive to produce good quality buildings, from the people financing the project, to the insurers, to the developers, to the actual consumers and people living in the projects, that I think government building codes are duplicative at very best, and very often are used for regulatory capture. So market urbanists are against the idea of building codes, government building codes. Urban growth boundaries. This is a very specific type of zoning that effectively draws lines around certain cities and says that suburban sprawl cannot go past those arbitrary lines. Market urbanists view this as something that necessarily reduces the supply of buildable land, and thus the supply of housing, and has had the effect of increasing home costs throughout the United States and really around the world wherever it's tried. Market urbanists, however, are even more against the idea of height, floor area ratio, and dwelling unit per acre regulations, and basically saying the market should not have to follow these arbitrary regulations that prevent density, and instead, if they want to build a 1,000-foot tall building, developers should be allowed to. But I'd say really the main thing that market urbanists are going after in effect to their housing stances is just the entire idea of planning and design review. When developers in major cities like Los Angeles or New York want to have a major project approved, say get a special use permit, they're having to go through potentially years of delay in millions of dollars in lobbying costs just to break ground. And so it's sort of like the entire architecture of regulation, besides what I've just mentioned, really gets codified into the planning and design review process, and it has the effect of squelching growth. And then I'd say the second leg of market urbanism theory is really transportation, because a lot of the criticism I get for my ideas boils down to, okay, so you want a lot of housing to get built and you want these really dense cities. So what happens when that causes a bunch of gridlock? And my answer to that is that just as we need to allow markets to work for housing and real estate in general, we need to allow markets to work for transportation. And the idea there is that transportation can be provided along the routes, in the modes, and via the operators chosen by the consumer, and that will create an organic system that kind of works out the congestion problem much more than the government managing transportation has managed to work out congestion. So one path to this is road pricing. That can include the market clearing price, charging market clearing prices for existing government roads. Although I'm really interested in the idea, and you're seeing this in different parts of the United States, I'm really interested in the idea of having private roads and bringing the brilliance of the private sector and the capitalist economy to the idea of roads, which traditionally, at least for the last century, has been a government managed operation. Another aspect of market urbanism transport theory is public transit reform. So I wouldn't say market urbanists are necessarily against the idea of public transit, although some might be. But at very least, I think there's a case for reforming or even privatizing certain aspects of mass transit agencies. I look at bureaucracies like SEPTA in Philadelphia and the New York MTA as sort of these patronage rackets that do not provide mass transit very well. And so if you go in and reform the contractor waste and the labor patronage and maybe privatize or outsource some of these aspects, then I think transit starts to improve in those cities. The second leg of that, and really I would say even more important, is the idea of private transit deregulation. So the status quo in a lot of cities around the US is that the public transit agency should have a monopoly on providing transit in the city, and often these upstart competitors that come from the private transit sector, things like jitneys and Uber and various small buses, they're squelched, and there's a regulatory regime that prevents them from being able to operate and compete with the public option. And I mean, not even just buses, like things like scooters and e-bikes, they're illegal in a lot of cities, or they're capped to the point that they can't really scale. And so, very hardline market urbanist opinion here is deregulate this industry and allow the private sector to compete with and possibly even replace public mass transit. Market-based right-of-way. So again, this kind of goes to the idea of charging for roads, and but it can apply to multiple aspects of urban right-of-way. So I'm thinking particularly like curb space. You go to places like New York and Chicago, and a lot of the very valuable curb space in some of the most dense neighborhoods is dedicated to free parking. And I think that cities ought to charge for that space and really diversify the potential uses. So, for example, if a restaurant wants outdoor seating in an area and wants to potentially lease the curb space right outside of the restaurant to put like seating for its customers, if it's willing to outbid somebody for the price to park there, then maybe that use should go for the restaurant seating. So in conclusion, market urbanism crosses free market policy and urban issues rooted from classical liberalism, calling for private sector actions that create organic growth and voluntary exchange within cities, rather than ones enforced by top-down government. Really, the crux of market urbanism is the idea that individuals know their interests best, and that cities operate best when millions of individuals can live by free will and by their own self-interests, and that actually works better for the whole than having a handful of apparatchiks working working in the central government, making decisions for millions of people. So it's really a call. Market urbanism is a call to decentralization and organic urban growth. And if you want more details about market urbanism, these ideas I'm talking about, I just wrote a book, and if you want to get involved in the movement, as far as like getting active in the social media and really having conversations with other market urbanists, these are the socials you can follow. I particularly recommend the Facebook group, Market Urbanism Report Facebook group. And I'm done, and thank you very much.
Scott, thanks. And folks in chat, I just showed you how to find the raise hand icon under the reactions tab around your Zoom controls. The pricing for roads that you mentioned kind of segues into my radio frequency engineer friend, Mary Bauer, who wants to raise some concerns around smart cities, specifically not in a city, but in a county, Stafford County, near a city, Fredericksburg, which is a place where a lot of people in DC live. Maybe they would live closer to DC, Scott, if there were less growth boundaries around Northern Virginia. So some folks actually have to commute ungodly distances to get an affordable place. I imagine the pricing would be, tracked with, some radio frequency identification device in the car. And the Internet of Things is a big part of smart cities. And we want to discuss that as well, because as a libertarian, I like everything else you said. I got a house on Capitol Hill that's limited by, some zoning limitations. Thank goodness we're 1 block away from the historical district. Otherwise, we couldn't, modernize our windows. But I think what you mentioned, repealing zoning, not requiring every startup to include parking, not duplicating building codes that builders already are going to want because they care about their reputation, and not squelching innovation with these planning reviews. And then segueing to the transportation flexibility to deal with the gridlock problem everyone's concerned about. You mentioned tech libertarians. Have you guys had any conversations about the Internet of Things and the 5G build of antennas outside your bedrooms and classrooms and offices on every other street lamp? Does your crowd see that as a totally good thing, or has anyone raised some concerns about having antennas every 100 feet?
Yeah, well, a vast majority of what we cover in the group and on various social threads is actually what I talked about in the slideshow, which is housing and transportation. And so I can't say that 5G really comes up very much. And I would think that having a really hot take in this context would be a little kind of out of my wheelhouse. So some of the things you're talking about, as far as I guess the potential surveillance coming from 5G, is not really something I've thought a great deal about. But yeah, I don't know. I know that National Landing in the Northern Virginia area, where Amazon was located, was talking about becoming a 5G neighborhood. And I think the benefits of 5G that they were espousing from that was that the rapid internet would enable more testing of autonomous vehicles, and because there's a certain AVs require a certain scanning in order to function and not run into things, and that purportedly being in a 5G neighborhood would allow the speed of internet that would cause that scanning to occur. And then I think the other benefits that they were talking about was that they wanted National Landing to become a metaverse zone. So I know that Virginia Tech is opening a technological hub in the neighborhood, and it's attracting other technology companies. And they wanted it to be a place where metaverse testing was more developed and frequent than it is in other parts of the US. And they were citing the 5G neighborhood as enabling the internet speed that would let that testing occur. So I look at that as a, I don't know if the process is market oriented, so to speak, but just looking at that from the surface and not really knowing a ton about the back end technology, that seems like a pretty good experiment to me. Like have a neighborhood that really focuses on high speed internet, and then leverage that high speed internet to test all kinds of additional technologies.
If I could jump in, I think these are all good ideas, and you're not hearing much on the other side in the media and perhaps in your group. And I think they would be great if the bureaucrats and the oligarchs, everybody running things, were good people. But it opens us up to a lot of potential harm and issues coming up down the road if we don't factor that in, right?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm open to hearing what the harms are, and I don't purport to say they don't exist. You know,
I mean, I wonder, just a quick one. You mentioned private roads. So, are you familiar with Route 66 here that goes into Washington?
Yes.
Okay, so right, I think it was sold to a private company, but the company is, I believe, Spanish, and now they're charging. It went from free. Well, it doesn't matter, but I've seen the price at $40-50 at rush hour to get to, to go into town. I mean, that's crazy. Most people, you can't afford that. We can't afford that, the average.
Right.
And so what happens there?
Well, if that's the cost of, I mean, a lot of the idea behind that privatization type thing is you're taking infrastructure that originally served as a public liability, but that the cost of which were more hidden because the costs are being entirely socialized, and in many cases, money is being poached from the general fund to help maintain the roads. I mean, that's how a lot of our interstates work at this point. And by privatizing it, you're not only taking the liability off of the taxpayer, but you're really showing the true cost of what that road really represents as far as operating and maintaining and repairing it. So to me, it's a market outcome, although you could argue that it's kind of a public-private monopoly as well. So it's not exactly ideal in my mind, but the tolling still seems better than hiding the cost through socialization.
I think, Scott, is it one of the standard libertarian answers to the regulatory capture that happens with these corporations that run the government functions, because they're always going to charge as much as they can, is to take away the monopoly aspect, so that if the Spanish company buying up all these private roads is trying to rake some profit, then how do we deal with zoning limitations to another road entrepreneur to building a competing road to use competition to lower the prices? And that gets into not in my backyard fights. Have you explored that conversation? Is how do you build more lanes? How do you build more roads?
Right. I mean, well, there's a lot of directions I guess I could go with that, but I mean, it starts with the fact that, yeah, it would be hard to build a competing road in Northern Virginia to compete with 66 because of what you're talking about. I mean, you say NIMBYism, and that's certainly one aspect of it, but also it would just be basic property rights, like who owns the title to all the different land that would need to be assembled in order to build a new road. And so, I mean, in this case, I would think that market urbanism might say, well, maybe the government should sell the tunneling rights below the road or below some other area of Northern Virginia to a private company. And, you've got all these great entrepreneurs like Elon Musk who are revolutionizing the ability to dig tunnels. So if an Elon Musk type could come in, dig his tunnel, build his own road to his specifications, and that competes with 66, that seems like it would be an optimum market outcome. Another thing and you really hear more about this overseas. I mean, I'm hearing about the Chinese government doing this a lot in Africa, which is you build decks above the existing road to add more capacity. You toll for those decks, and so that becomes, you could structure it any number of ways. But I guess as a market thinker, I would say, well, if a Chinese company wanted to come in and build a deck that competes with the Spanish company that is operating the road at grade level, then that's pretty close to a market competition for something that traditionally requires more collective action and is not necessarily market oriented.
Thank you for that brilliant answer. I forgot about Musk. I remember him on Joe Rogan saying that digging deep is not as unsafe as people fear, specifically in California with the earthquake, continental meeting points there with the fault lines. And I think in Guanajuato in the 70s when I was a kid near Mexico City, I think there's a lot of underground highway stuff there. That's a great answer. The decking is a great answer. Here's another libertarian answer. Decentralized unconstitutional programs from DC, which would lower the demand for everyone to go flock to DC for a government job. If you
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. That's a great panacea. You clear out the overhead, the top-heavy dynamic of DC, and that'll clear up the congestion a bit, don't you think?
I would almost think that the road privatization idea would happen before the decentralization of DC happens. I don't think that's ever going to happen, unfortunately.
You're a realist.
But let me actually add another example, because DC is a very specific case study, and the northeastern cities are a specific case study because there is so much issue with land titles and space constraints and things like that. But I mean, you can look at a place like Texas that has all kinds of open land, and they actually are building private roads. Texas has quite a lot of toll roads. So does Florida. It's not, and again, I'm thinking of specific toll roads. Like, for example, there's something called State Highway 130 that runs roughly parallel to I-35. And I-35 goes through San Antonio, Austin, Dallas. I-35 is really one of the main freight routes from Mexico up through the urbanized spine of Texas. And it is a government-run road that is highly congested. In my mind, it's very mismanaged. And so there was a public-private partnership that was conducted a couple decades ago to build State Highway 130 that runs parallel to I-35 through more of like the prairie land of Texas. And truckers pay a crap load to go on that public-private road, because the time savings from not having to go on I-35 is worth it to them. So it's not a fully private road, but it's kind of in the direction that I'm talking about. And I think a lot of the less developed areas of the country could be doing those types of privatization experiments.
Indeed. Paul, before you ask your question, if I could, I promised Mary a chance to talk a bit more about the Stafford County wireless smart city projects, and how with unelected nonprofits are taking away people's informed consent to complain about what's going on. Mary, if you can be concise, then Paul, go ahead and ask your question. Mary, you want to unmute yourself? Go ahead.
Yeah. So you had captured my concerns here, where you said individuals know their own self-interest. Technocracy wants a wireless mesh around us 15 feet and below. They want to talk to everything in our house, whether we want them to or not. So I don't know how you keep these people who, if you have the biggest amount of money, you have the biggest amount of self-interest. I don't know how you keep balance with people who say, I don't want this wireless mesh. It's okay if you have a tower, a mile away from me, but I don't want this wireless mesh invading my privacy. How do you create balance with this model, that you have laid out here in two areas, housing and transportation, you didn't talk about what happens to the rest of the government. Do they remain intact, or are we all succumbing to an AI god that makes all our decisions for us? You know, whoever this person or they or technocracy or, you know, your urban marketplace, you know, are going to be invisible people to the average resident. So how do they have a voice? I don't know. But what you're suggesting when it comes to wireless, and I think there's a component here that, you know, you may have a missing piece here in your model, is that it's kind of like a scene out of Minority Report, where you walk down the street and they read your phone, and they scan your eyes, and then they pop up an ad for you. Or you walk into a dentist office, they do the same thing on your phone. It's like it becomes a part of you, and it's really an invasion of privacy. And this is what they want. Your model will help them get there quicker. So for somebody like me, it's like an analogy is like, if I had a peanut allergy, you want to feed me peanuts all day. So how does that help people who don't want this wireless mesh, whether it be for health reasons or for privacy or for not, you know, not granting informed consent, and all these people who have their self-interest in their pocketbook lined up for only the things that they want?
And before you answer, Scott, real quickly, Mary, explain what's happening with Stafford County, the government, nonprofits, no informed consent.
So the Center for Innovative Technology is one of 6 NGOs, which are all 501c3s, that are getting free taxpayer money to do these experiments, you know, all over Stafford County. They're all wireless, nothing wired. That's not even a consideration. And we don't know where they pop up. We have no say in them, but, you know, we are going to be getting, you know, everything wireless. The smart meters is just the beginning of it. This is something that just got rolled out in my area here. I don't want one, but I have to get one because they're not giving me a choice.
A smart meter for what? For your home?
Well, it's right now it's for power, but I think gas and water are going to go the same way. And I am electromagnetically sensitive, and I can feel these frequencies, and they make me sick. And there's a lot of people like me. You know, I would venture to say 10 to 15%, but they will never admit to that because there's no way to prove it. They'll admit to 3%. But, you know, there is no balance here. That's what I see as the problem. My county, the one that I live in for 25 years, has decided that this is the way it's going to be because the individuals who know their own self-interests are doing this. And so how do you do that without a local government?
Well, I don't know that my model takes us to that dystopia that you described faster, because a lot of the entire premise of market urbanism is that governments need to be reduced in size or altogether dismantled. And it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is the collusion between private tech companies and governments who are and NGOs who are getting all kinds of taxpayer money to write contracts for this kind of stuff.
They're not writing contracts, they're writing algorithms. They have a consortium of 21 universities that are feeding this Center for Innovative Technology, which, by the way, is not a government. I mean, it's a private company, just the way you said. Yeah, and they're getting funded by government to do these algorithms, and then they apply them to lots of things like property taxes. And then they decide, you know, based on behavior and based on all the information they collect on you, what price you're going to pay. So I know this sounds like very, you know, like not common, but you have to read in between the lines. Like, why do they need all these people doing algorithms? What do the algorithms do? They're used for social behavior, to control social behavior, to predict your behavior. Now, when you have a model set up that has a high population density, it's like a hotbed for collecting data. I mean, that's why I said what I said. You're basically handing them over the keys to set up their wireless mesh networks to collect as much data in as little time as possible. I'm not saying you personally, I'm just saying with this model that you've proposed. Now, in Stafford, they have the 3-pronged stool where it's a government NGO partnership, but the government's role is basically being blind. They don't participate as you would expect, you know, a government person to participate. They basically hand over the keys and the power to the NGOs. So when I heard about Center for Innovative Technology, putting up all these towers without any permits or any input from the community. And one of them only 7 miles away from me on Indian reservation land and crow's nest, where the crows, a lot of birds who are crows live there at the 30-foot level. They put this tower there. And when I called the Stafford County Chief Technology Officer, like, where's the NEPA review on this tower? He said, don't call me, call KGI who owns the tower. So he wanted no part of it. So I'm just showing you that this thing about, I see the critical pivot point being that, individuals know their own self-interest, and he most certainly did.
If I can interject here before you answer, Scott, and then Paul, thanks for your patience. I think the libertarian urban model would address this in part from what we see with realtor sales. There's about 20% cut in home values when there's a cell tower nearby. And now, as people get educated on the threats of these different 5G wireless antennas that have to be mounted on every other street pole to work, that's hurting values. And you mentioned, Scott, property rights. It's not just NIMBY. People don't want whatever near them. I think part of the value in what you presented today is in people getting what they want in terms of housing and transportation. Increasingly, people are not going to want the 5G when there's actually faster internet through fiber cabling, which is more secure and private to your door. And so I think through property rights, people are going to fight back because we've lost control of government that has been captured by special interests using NGOs to get their experimental, social control projects in play in certain counties like Mary's experiencing. Why don't you hold your answer, Paul? Get your question real quick, and then let you answer both. Paul.
Okay, I'll have a bit of a comment and then maybe a short question at the end. I think it's great to have debate about ideas, and I really appreciate your program, Charles. I think you do a good job bringing good voices on. I found this presentation completely naive. I can't believe that this is really what you think should be the future of how we proceed. At least in Petaluma, California, where I live, I am very happy we have an urban growth boundary. That is because we have green space we can all enjoy. And that went all the way to the state Supreme Court and was fought back in the 1970s, and we won in California to limit growth because that was a public good. The part of your analysis that you're not showing here is where is the voice for the public in the public rights of way. You're trying to say, oh, well, we all can somehow operate in a free market system. Well, no, the people at the top drive the show. What you had listed as all of what you want to get done is what every single property developer says to our city when they try to get variances to just get what they want done. And thank God we have a planning commission that will actually go ahead and say, no, it's inappropriate here to have this many units. We're going to cut it down to this many units. No, we actually have to think about congestion. We can't just sit there and let the market take care of it. The belief that the market will take care of it is without evidence. Bring evidence forward to show that in a market where you don't have a lot of players. You see, a market works when you have lots of players and lots of competition. In building roads, that doesn't happen. You don't have lots of players or lots of competition. You just have profit opportunity.
The road system in the United States was private before the government came in and effectively socialized and nationalized it.
I do understand, but it does work, and it is congested in certain areas. But the point is that everybody can use it because our taxpayer dollars go to do it. And it's not stratified by, oh, well, you could afford to use the road, so go ahead and use it. All right. Everybody can use it. Everybody pays the price if it becomes too congested. So therefore, you have a discussion of what to do. Hey, you know what?
Well, everybody could afford to use it back in the 1800s when it was being used for horse carriages. People could afford it. They eventually got frustrated about the tolls, and so they decided they were going to socialize it. But it's not a completely abstract thing. I mean, there are.
No, but you're talking about the 1800s and horses versus a Spanish company coming in and buying an American road and trying to extract that money and take it out of our economy. I mean, why don't we actually just do more decentralization and make it within our
That's what
economy?
I'm saying. Do more. Okay, well,
So don't allow Spanish
to
companies to
comment
buy your
on
roads. That's my point.
To comment on the public process you were talking about that led to growth boundaries in California.
Sure.
I don't think it's naive necessarily, and in fact, I think thinking that the public process is kind of this lovey-dovey just concept, to me, that is naive, because in my mind, a lot of the democratic processes about land use are in fact captured. It's not so much everybody is getting a say as it is certain interest groups are capturing the conversation. So
unless the public gets organized and they function.
Just let me. Okay, so in the specific case of a growth boundary, sure, the existing residents might want to have a growth boundary because that's nice to them to have a preserved area, and it also has the effect of increasing their own home values. But the interest group that it is working in counter to are newer prospective homeowners who want to enter into the area and are having to pay a significant markup because you have cordoned off large portions of the metropolitan area against development. So I'm looking at, there's two sides to this story, and there's a cost and benefit to every regulation. And I think the market solves those costs versus benefits much better than the fundamentally captured and collusional, quote unquote, public process.
Yeah, I'm looking for the evidence of that. I don't see where the market.
Well, there's all kinds of evidence. I mean, I would suggest reading the work of Randall O'Toole, who has written ad nauseum about how urban growth boundaries increase home prices every single place that they're tried, whether it's Hawaii, all the West Coast states, a lot of the Northeastern states. Like there is evidence that they increase home prices.
But so you're saying that increased home prices is absolutely terrible. Can't do it.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am,
okay.
because it's an example of
it's an investment.
No,
you want your investment to increase in value.
No, it's not. No, I view housing as more of a commodity that everybody should be able to afford.
Well, why there would be real estate investors if it wasn't an investment? Of course, it's an investment.
Well, somehow, I mean, there still would be. But
well, that's what I'm trying to tell you is that we in California are doing it differently than what you're describing. Okay,
I know, and California has the most expensive housing market in the entire country.
Well, let me tell you what's going on. We had a state law passed, and we're actually having to now take on higher density projects and doing infill, and it's being required of all cities. And so we are in the process now of building 5, 6 to 7 story buildings throughout our communities where they, there was slow growth. And so the point is that we haven't changed our urban growth boundary. We have enabled more denser housing within the boundary. That's how they're dealing with this in California.
I think they ought to do both.
I hear you, but we love our growth boundary because we actually get to go out and hike in areas that aren't overrun by urban sprawl. If you take a look at Silicon Valley versus Northern California, north of San Francisco, you'd much rather live where we live for that reason.
I wouldn't. I mean,
okay. Well,
I also think you have a model to say what great success they've had in using similar type of a model similar to what you're suggesting, and it's the telecom industry. They can put it wherever they want. They're not restricted by how things are zoned. They can put it right in front of your house. And how many people like that industry? I mean, for the people, you're restricting choices for the public for progress.
Now, if you didn't have zoning laws, then you wouldn't have the Petaluma wireless ordinance, which says it's inappropriate to put a wireless antenna in a residential zone. And that is true because it is a residential area that doesn't need and should not have industrial equipment in it, period.
And they have these lobbyists that are, get paid big bucks for every day of the week. They're out there whispering, not in local government's ears, but in congressmen's ears, and you up the ante. So,
yes,
I just don't understand how the model is viable.
I go through, a lot of my book is dedicated to dealing with the externality question, which is a lot of what you're bringing up here. So if a factory, and the interesting thing is that back in the 1800s, it was smokestacks, but it sounds like the big externality driver nowadays might be 5G. towers. But in either case, yes, I'm very much of like a quote unquote Pigouvian economist who thinks that if somebody is creating an externality, be it land use or something else, they should have to pay the interested parties who are being affected by that. So
yeah, you can't pay me enough for that. I'm sorry, I'm not going to have you put a poisonous, toxic factory just polluting my entire home environment and forcing me to move. There's no.
Well, then maybe it shouldn't be allowed.
That's the point. It's not allowed by zoning laws.
The balance.
Okay, but there's a difference between saying we should use zoning to prevent truly toxic uses and saying we should use zoning to completely cordon off a metro area because we want it to be trees and forests rather than tract homes. Like those are not the same things.
They're not the same things, but well, here's the bottom line. They're local values, you see, and local control is about local values. And it's okay to have a local government to express that city's local values. And if that city's local values is to keep a green belt, fine, no problem. There should be nothing against that.
Well, fair enough, but then I would say that it sounds like your local values are exclusion.
Our local values are not exclusion. We're building 7-story things to allow more people to come in. We're doing everything we can to control congestion by saying, how do we get people out of cars and put them into bikes and electric bikes? We're looking at the future that's going to be more dense, but we're not going to give up our local values, not to give up our urban growth boundary in order to solve a social problem.
Okay, well, Houston would be an example of a metro area that does not have growth boundaries and has quite a lot of sprawl, and there's a lot of financialization really that has driven it, and so you've got a bunch of suburban tract subdivisions dotting all around the city, and that has had the effect of making Houston very affordable. It grows much faster than any California city. It permits way more housing, and as a result, Houston has median home values that are actually below the national average.
But then you have to live in Houston.
I view that as a good thing.
But you would have to live in Houston.
It is affordable for the working class to live there and develop a better life. And that's why people are gravitating into Houston. So if you want to talk about community values, I would say Houston is an upwardly mobile, market-oriented opportunity city. And I would say California is effectively something where a bunch of rich people go and want to have their green belts and their preservation and their kind of retrograde view of how their community should work. And then nobody who's not rich can live in these cities in California.
Well, I'm telling you that how we're getting the people who are not rich enough to buy the home to live here is to enable more dense housing for them to rent at lower rates. That's how.
Well, except it doesn't happen.
It is happening. It's happening right
now. California has some of the lowest. California has some of the lowest housing permits of any state. Matter of fact, California.
You're talking about yesteryear. You're not talking about today. Today's 2022.
California has less housing units per capita than any other state.
Correct.
Except Utah.
They're addressing that through this little legislation from Scott Wiener.
And it's great, but it's not happening quickly enough.
It's happening very quickly. We've built these things in the last 18 months.
I mean, they just put up a whole string of townhouses in probably 5 different areas that are, within 5 miles of where I live in 6 months. I mean, I don't know, maybe your information is dated, but I'm telling you that they are putting up these houses faster than you can blink an eye. And I don't know who they're building them for. I mean, I don't know where these people are coming from.
There's no doubt the permit numbers will tell you the story of whether you're building or not building. I understand that. There is real evidence there. And you can say that California isn't building enough homes. And I believe that would be a true statement based on the permits. So I will admit to all of that. Okay. The problem that I have with no zoning laws is you get some economic interest that's going to go out of control, such as what's going on in Texas with respect to the 5G wireless thing. Pretty much homeowners have no say because they have a bad state bill. And that's going everywhere. I know people in Houston who are just absolutely leaving because of what's happening to their neighborhoods. Okay.
Yeah, so 5G is linked at the hip with your model, whether you accept that or believe that or not, because the urban density is what attracts the telecom people. And their model is your model. I'll put it wherever I want, however I want, because I'm going to make some money.
Yeah, and I'm
their
saying is that there's a
self-interest.
public interest that we have a chance to defend because there's a local government and there are local zoning laws. And I would never want to see those removed ever.
All right, so Linda, you got the last question.
First of all, I have to ask you why your plan is not including some green areas like a park, gardens, things like this, so important for human health. Second, I cannot believe that you don't know that 5G is #1 health problem for human beings, for animals, and for trees. Now, because I am an international panel against 5G, we have every block, at least in Baltimore, antennas with 5G. They're going to put on satellites thousands of 5G around Earth, so no one can escape this crime against humanity. And if you like, we'll have an email from you to send you hundreds of references of PDF and webinars against 5G and how it affects our health. Not only mental health, not only cooks the brain, but every cell is affected. And bottom line, which has to do as you said, your IoT, cars driving without driver, things like this, depends on 5G. And now they prepared the 6G. So to tell you the worst crime, last week I was for 2 days, 24 hours in a conference on digital medicine. For digital medicine, you need to have 5G and wearables and things like this. So people, they don't have to look to visit the doctor, but the doctor will do everything over the wearables and through 5G, all those things, which is the end of health system. So how you fit your model within this context, and you don't stop all this crime around 5G, IoT, and things like this? Tell you that. That's my question.
Well, Scott, it sounds like you got an earful on 5G. In defense of your program, which I support, I think it's a function of property rights. I mean, already realtors are up in arms about towers nearby. As home buyers get educated, they're not going to want a home in a neighborhood in a smart city that's going to, make them chronically diseased from this radiation mesh. So it's going to be a NIMBY kind of dynamic, I think, where people refuse to, give home sellers the price they want because there's a 5G antenna on their neighbor's roof, which is current law called the OTARD rule. You can't stop that. There's no informed consent. You haven't really answered that question. I think might be a good final point. How can property rights, not just local governments, I get Paul's point. There's some libertarians, understand the power of local governments. We have less opposition to that than we do with overbloated federal government. How do you see property rights or groups of owners in a neighborhood to decide their smart city, to keep out some of these externalities that they don't like? You started on that topic with smokestacks and now with the radiation mesh.
Well, I have always been somebody who is interested in the Kosian bargaining process and the idea of Pigouvian taxation, kind of bringing those two ideas together, being that if you're a business interest that is creating externalities onto people and inflicting harm and disease onto them, you either need to give them a payoff that the two parties agree to, or if you can't reach an agreement, then the externality should not be allowed. I've talked about this with roads as well. Like I'm generally against the expansion of roads in many urban contexts because it spews out toxins to the surrounding communities, and that if that's going to be the case, then the road should be compelled and effectively made to pay for those damages that they're creating to the surrounding communities. So it sounds like that would be, again, I'm not an expert on what you guys are talking about today as far as the externalities from 5G. It's something I'll look forward to researching more. But the same concepts apply, and I don't think that they're counter to libertarianism. Like that's very much of in my mind, a classical liberal principle is that if you are harming the surroundings, then you should have to pay for it or not be allowed.
Yeah, that's something a lot of folks get wrong about libertarianism, is that we want those who harm to pay the price.
Yeah, but they don't pay the price. But they don't pay the price. That's the bottom line.
Well, they've captured the process, we want to fix that. It's called regulatory capture. So thanks, Scott. Why don't you tell folks how to reach you, and we'll stop the recording.
Sure. If you wanted to email me about some of the stuff, it's scott@marketurbanismreport.com. And feel free to get involved on my social threads and bring up these debates, because we have pretty rabid debates, and I'm sure my followers would be willing to serve as your foil.
We get our arguments directly to our local government, because that's where we spend our time. We get things done that way. So I don't do much on social media, but I certainly do it directly to my local government.
Okay, if I can give Scott the last word. Scott, why don't you give us your website again?
Marketurbanismreport.com.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you. And it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off, and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt2wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.